There was a time in this country when a single potato, just one, stood between a family and an empty table. Not a bag of potatoes, not a pot full of them. One potato, sitting on a wooden cutting board, and a mother staring at it like it owed her something. And somehow, some way, that one potato became dinner for 5 people, maybe 6 if a neighbor knocked at the door. If you know what I'm talking about, if that image just landed somewhere deep in your chest, then you already know this story. And if you grew up a little more comfortable than that, stay with me anyway, because what those families figured out in their kitchens wasn't just about surviving, it was about a kind of wisdom we've nearly lost, a way of thinking about food and family, and enough that this world could use a whole lot more of right now. There's a saying I heard more times than I can count growing up, and I want you to hold on to it through this whole story. My grandmother used to say it every time she sat down to a thin supper. She'd look around that table at all of us kids and she'd say, "The meal isn't in what's on the plate, it's in who's around it." We're going to come back to those words before this is over, and I think by the end, they're going to mean something different to you than they do right now. Welcome to Grandpa Almanac. I'm so glad you're here today. Pull up a chair and get comfortable, because we're going to spend some time at the kitchen table together. Before we get into this story, I want to ask you something. Drop it in the comments down below. Where did you grow up? And do you remember a meal your family made that stretched just about nothing into something? I read every single one of those, and those comments are some of the best conversations I've ever been part of. Now, let's go back. Let's go all the way back to a kitchen that smelled like onion and wood smoke and something simmering low on the stove. Let's talk about the poor man's meal. And let's talk about why the people who made it weren't poor in the ways that actually matter. Number one, it started with knowing what you actually had. I want you to picture a kitchen in the early 1950s. Maybe Appalachia, maybe the Mississippi Delta, maybe a row house in Pittsburgh or a farmhouse outside of Tulsa. The details change, but the scene is the same. A woman, and it was almost always a woman, at least in the kitchens I knew, standing in front of a pantry that didn't have much to offer. And instead of feeling sorry about what wasn't there, she was cataloging what was. One potato, maybe 2 if it was a good week. An onion, always an onion. A heel of bread going stale. Some bacon grease saved in a tin by the stove. A few dried beans she'd been soaking since morning, just in case. A cup of cornmeal. Whatever came in from the garden if it was summer, and if it wasn't summer, whatever she'd put up in jars back when the garden was giving. My mother used to do this every single evening before she decided what to cook. She'd stand there with the pantry door open and just look, quiet, taking inventory like a general before a campaign. I was maybe 8 years old, and I asked her once, I said, "Mama, what are you doing?" And she said, without turning around, "I'm counting my army, baby. You can't fight a battle if you don't know your soldiers." That image has stayed with me 70 years. A woman and her pantry taking stock. Because here's the thing, the first skill of stretching a meal isn't a recipe. It's awareness. It's knowing exactly what you have before you start wishing for what you don't. Those women could look at a near empty shelf and see a meal. Not because they had some magic gift, because they'd trained themselves to see possibility instead of lack. We've lost that. Most of us today open the refrigerator, stare into it for a full minute, decide there's nothing to eat, and close it again with a full refrigerator. Those women would have fed a family of 5 out of what we throw away in a week without thinking twice. And it all started with knowing what you actually had. Number 2, fat was the first ingredient, and it was never wasted. That tin of bacon grease sitting next to the stove wasn't an accident. It was a savings account. Every time you fried bacon, every time you cooked pork, every time there was any kind of fat rendered off any kind of meat, it went into that tin. And that tin was the foundation of everything. You have to understand what fat does in a poor kitchen. It does what money does in a rich one. It makes things possible that weren't possible before. A bare potato boiled in water is sustenance. That same potato cooked in a skillet with a spoonful of bacon grease becomes something your family will ask for again. The fat carries flavor. It browns things. It makes the humble taste like it has some dignity. My grandmother had a cast iron skillet that was so well seasoned it was nearly black, and she treated it like fine china. She never let water sit in it. She wiped it dry after every use and set it back on the stove where it belonged. I remember watching her heat that skillet before she put anything in it, watching a small spoonful of grease melt and begin to shimmer, and the smell that came off it was something I still associate with safety, with home, with the feeling that no matter what was happening outside, in here things were going to be all right. You never start cooking, she told me once, until the pan tells you it's ready. You have to listen to your pan. I was young enough that I thought she meant it literally. I'd lean in close to the cast iron like it was going to whisper to me. She'd laugh and say, "Not with your ears, honey, with your eyes. See how it moves? That's it talking." Lard, bacon grease, butter when you had it, and you didn't always, chicken fat skimmed off the top of a pot of broth. This was the currency of the poor kitchen, and the women who ran those kitchens understood it with a depth that would embarrass most professional cooks today. They knew how hot to get it, they knew how much to use, they knew when it had gone bad and needed to be replaced, and they never, ever threw it away. Number 3, the potato itself could do more than you ever imagined. Now we get to the star of the story. That single potato on the wooden cutting board. And I want to tell you something that might surprise you. In the hands of a woman who knew what she was doing, one medium potato could legitimately stretch to feed a family. It sounds impossible. It wasn't. Let me show you how. The first thing you do is you don't peel it. The skin has nutrients and body, and more than that, it has bulk. Every thin slice of potato skin you throw away is a bite of dinner you've just tossed in the trash. You scrub it clean, and those old-time women scrubbed vegetables the way they scrubbed everything, thoroughly, with intention, and you slice it thin. As thin as you can manage. Paper thin if your knife was sharp enough. Then you slice your onion, also thin. And here's where the alchemy begins. You start those onions in the bacon grease in that cast iron skillet, low and slow, and you let them soften and turn translucent and start to go a little golden at the edges. And the smell that fills that kitchen is enough to make everyone in the house wander in from whatever they were doing. Then the potatoes go in, layered over those onions, and you press them down flat, and you add just a splash of water, just enough to create a little steam, and you put a lid on that skillet and you let it go. Low heat, patient. You don't rush a poor man's meal. You can't. The patience is part of the recipe. What comes out 20-25 minutes later is a skillet full of potato and onion that has softened and absorbed that fat and that steam and those flavors, and the bottom layer has gone crispy and golden from the grease. You flip it out onto a plate like a pancake, and it holds together, and it smells incredible, and it looks like something. It looks like a real meal, because it is. I remember the first time my mother put that skillet potato cake on the table, and my little brother's eyes went wide, and he said, "Is that from a restaurant?" He was 5. She laughed so hard she had to sit down. "No, baby," she said, "that's from our kitchen, same as always." And he couldn't believe it, because it looked like celebration food. And it was just a celebration of a different kind. Number 4. Bread stretched everything, and waste was a sin. There was a commandment in the kitchens I grew up around, and it was as firm as anything written in the Bible. Thou shalt not waste bread. Bread going stale wasn't a problem, it was an ingredient. And the women who understood that could take a loaf that had gone rock hard and turn it into 3 different things before they were done with it. Stale bread, torn into chunks and soaked in a little milk or water, becomes a binder. You mix it into whatever you're making to add body. A little bit of egg if you had an egg, and sometimes you did, because a few chickens were almost universal even in town. And that soaked bread mixed into your potato situation becomes something closer to a potato cake that holds its shape and slices like a pie. But here's the other thing bread did in a poor kitchen. It was the great equalizer at the table. You could put down a skillet of potato and onion and a basket of bread, and suddenly it looked like enough. The bread made the meal feel complete in a way that the potato alone couldn't. It gave people something to pick up and hold in their hands. It gave them something to sop up the last of the grease and the onion juice from their plate, and it filled the corners. My grandmother made cornbread most often because cornmeal was cheap and she could get it in quantity. She made it in a cast iron pan, started on the stove top and finished in the oven, and it came out with a crust on the bottom that crackled when you cut it. She'd cut it into squares and wrap the leftover in a clean cloth, and that cloth-wrapped cornbread would sit on the counter and be eaten for the next 2 days, getting better as it dried a little, better for dunking in a glass of buttermilk or crumbling into a bowl of whatever soup came next. Bread's not a side dish, she'd tell me. Bread's the meal's backbone. Everything else is just the flavor. And she was right. Those families ate bread with every single meal, not because they wanted to, but because it was the most calories per penny available to them, and they were doing math they never wrote down but never stopped calculating. Number 5. Beans were the hidden protein that made it all work. I mentioned those beans soaking since morning, and I don't want to pass over them too quickly, because beans might be the single most important food in the history of the American poor kitchen. Dried beans, pinto beans, navy beans, black-eyed peas. Whatever grew in that region, whatever could be bought in a 25-pound sack for next to nothing, that's what sat in the bottom of the pot and made everything else possible. The magic of beans is that they're patient. They sit in their dried state on a shelf for months, even years, and they wait for you. They don't spoil. They don't cost much. And when you give them a long soak and a low simmer, they become something generous and filling and, yes, genuinely nourishing in a way that kept families alive through the hardest years. Now, here's where the potato and the bean met in the poor kitchen. When you're cooking a pot of beans, whatever flavoring you put in that pot, and it was usually that bacon grease again, or a piece of salt pork, or a ham hock if you were lucky, that fat and that seasoning permeated everything. And if you dropped a potato or two into that bean pot in the last half hour of cooking, those potatoes absorbed the flavor of the beans and the pork and the seasoning, and they swelled up and got soft and became something completely different than they were on their own. My uncle used to say, "Beans and potatoes together is greater than the sum of their parts." He wasn't an educated man. He'd quit school at 13 to work, but he understood something about cooking that you can't learn in culinary school. He'd grown up eating it, and he knew in his body what it meant when those two things came together in the right pot at the right time. And that pot of beans and potatoes, with some cornbread alongside it, was a complete meal. It had carbohydrates for energy. It had protein from the beans. It had fat from the pork seasoning. It was, nutritionally, a much better meal than a lot of people eat today with a full grocery store at their disposal. Because those women understood balance not as a concept, but as a necessity. If you're finding this story touching something in you, something you want to remember and share, I want to take a second and ask you to subscribe to this channel. Hit that button right now so you don't miss what we're putting out here. Every week we go back to these stories, these skills, these ways of living that deserve to be remembered. And I think you know this is worth keeping. We'll get right back to it. Number 6. Flavor came from technique, not from what you bought. Here's something the poor kitchen understood that the modern kitchen has mostly forgotten. Flavor isn't something you buy, it's something you build. And the techniques those women used, techniques they'd learned from their own mothers and grandmothers, could extract more flavor out of a humble set of ingredients than most people today would believe possible. Caramelization. That's the fancy word for what happens when you cook an onion long enough at the right heat and it turns from sharp and pungent into sweet and deeply savory. It costs nothing extra. It just costs time and attention. And a properly caramelized onion added to almost anything, potato, bean, whatever you had, elevated the whole dish into something that smelled and tasted like it had been worked on. Browning. The Maillard reaction, scientists call it now, but those women just called it getting some color on it. When you let a piece of potato sit in hot fat without moving it until the bottom side goes brown and a little crispy, something chemical happens that creates dozens of new flavor compounds that weren't there before. The potato goes from tasting like a potato to tasting like roasted, nutty, complex potato. Same ingredient, same fat, more patience, more flavor. I want to tell you about a neighbor of ours named Mrs. Hargett, because she was a genius in the kitchen the way Mozart was a genius with a piano. She could take the same 5 or 6 ingredients my mother used and make something that tasted completely different, and the reason was technique. She'd get her skillet hotter before the potato went in. She'd let things go a little longer before she stirred. She'd add just a pinch of something at the right moment. Once I was watching her cook, I couldn't have been more than 10, and I asked her what her secret was. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "My secret is I don't rush God's work. The food knows when it's done. My job is just to not get in the way." I didn't understand that fully then. I think I understand it now. Those women seasoned with salt when they had it, and carefully, because salt was not always in abundance. They used black pepper. They used dried herbs from the garden, thyme, sage, whatever grew. They might have a bottle of hot sauce or a jar of pickled peppers, because acid and heat could wake up a dish that otherwise sat flat. They understood that a squeeze of something acidic at the end, a splash of vinegar, a few drops of pickle brine, could lift a whole pot of beans into something with brightness and contrast and life. Number 7. The egg was a miracle worker, and you used every part of it. If the potato was the foundation of the poor man's meal and the beans were the protein, the egg was the wild card that could transform either one of them into something else entirely. And here's the thing about eggs in a poor kitchen. You didn't necessarily eat them for breakfast the way most people think of it today. You used them where they do the most good. An egg cracked into a skillet of half-cooked potato and onion, spread around and scrambled through, turned a side dish into a main dish. 1 egg for a whole skillet, not 1 egg per person. That egg stretched through the vegetables, added richness and protein and a silkiness that made everything taste more substantial. A boiled egg, hard-boiled, kept whole, sliced thin, and laid over a plate of beans or potato became a garnish that made the meal look like it had been planned with care. It said, at the table, that this family wasn't just eating to survive. They were eating with some intention about it. An egg and cornbread. That 1 egg in the cornbread batter was what separated cornbread that was tender and had some lift to it from cornbread that was dense and crumbly and dry. My grandmother guarded her 1 egg for the cornbread the way some people guard fine wine. She wouldn't let anybody eat it scrambled in the morning because it was spoken for. "That egg," she'd say, pointing at it on the counter, "belongs to tonight's bread." I remember once I was maybe 12, and a neighbor boy came over in the morning and saw the egg sitting there, and he said, "Can I have that?" And before I could answer, my grandmother appeared in the doorway of the kitchen like she'd been summoned, and she said, very quietly, "That egg has a job to do tonight. You're welcome to some cornbread later." And she smiled when she said it, but there was no negotiation happening. That egg had a purpose, and she'd planned around it since yesterday. That's a kind of thinking, assigning purpose to ingredients, planning backward from the meal to the raw material that most of us have never had to practice. But it produces a clarity about food and value that I think we've lost something by not having. Number 8. The pot liquor was never thrown away. Now I need to tell you about pot liquor, because if you don't know what that is, you've missed one of the true secrets of the Southern and Appalachian poor kitchen. Pot liquor, sometimes spelled pot liquor, is the liquid left behind in the pot after you've cooked down a mess of greens or a pot of beans or anything that's been simmered for a long time with seasoning. That liquid is not waste. That liquid is where the flavor went. It's rich and dark and complex and loaded with the nutrition that cooked out of whatever was in that pot, and the women in those kitchens knew it down to their bones. They saved it. They used it for the next meal's cooking liquid. They fed it to the children in a cup with a piece of cornbread to dunk in it. I had an aunt who would finish a pot of green beans long simmered with a piece of fatback and some onion, and she'd set the empty pot on the table with a ladle in it and a basket of cornbread, and we'd ladle that pot liquor into our bowls and eat it like soup. Because it was soup. It was better than soup. It was the concentrated essence of everything that had been cooked. The pot doesn't lie, my aunt would say. Whatever went in there, the best of it is still in that pot. Don't you dare pour it out. And nobody did. We'd eat the pot liquor, and then the cornbread would sop up whatever clung to the sides of the bowl, and by the time dinner was over, you'd had the greens and the broth and the bread, and you were full and warm and, honestly, happy in a way that has very little to do with how much was on the table. There's also this. That pot liquor, from a pot of beans especially, can be the starting liquid for tomorrow's meal. You don't start with water. You start with yesterday's pot liquor, and you add today's beans or today's potato or whatever you're making, and the flavor builds on itself, layer after layer, day after day. Some families kept this going for weeks. The pot never fully emptied. Things were added, liquid was replenished, and what came out at the end of a week tasted like the whole week's cooking combined. There's a word for this in French cooking, perpetual stew, but those American kitchen women didn't need a French word for it. They'd been doing it since long before anyone wrote it down anywhere. Number 9. The table itself was part of the meal. Now, I want to say something that might seem like I've gotten off the subject, but I promise you I haven't. Because we've been talking about ingredients and techniques and the physical act of stretching a potato into dinner, and all of that is true and real. But there's a dimension of the poor man's meal that has nothing to do with what was in the pot. It was the table, the actual gathering, the ritual of it. In the families I grew up around, dinner was not something you did in shifts. It was not something you ate standing over the sink or in front of the television. It was not something you ordered on your phone and ate from a container alone in your car. Dinner was when the family was all in one place at one time, and there was a moment, however brief, when the world outside did not exist. My grandfather would come in from whatever he'd been doing, and he'd wash his hands at the kitchen sink, and then he'd sit down at the head of that table, and something changed in the room. The noise of the day quieted. My grandmother would bring whatever was on the stove to the table, and my grandfather would look at it, and he would say the same thing every single night. He'd say, "Looks good, Mama," whether it was a feast or a potato skillet and cornbread. "Looks good, Mama." And she'd sit down across from him, and they'd bow their heads and say grace, and then they'd eat. The meal wasn't in what's on the plate, it's in who's around it. That table was where things were said that couldn't be said anywhere else. It was where children learned how adults talked about problems. It was where a hard day got reported on and either laughed about or understood. It was where you found out that your sister had gotten a gold star at school, or that your brother had gotten into some trouble, or that your father had lost a client and things were going to be a little tighter for a while. The table was the family's nervous system, and the thin meal, the potato stretched into dinner for 6, was not a lesser version of a rich meal. It was the same ritual, the same gathering, the same "looks good, Mama," and the same grace and the same conversation. The food was just the excuse to convene. The food was just the context. What was actually being fed at that table was something that doesn't show up in any calorie count. Number 10. What they knew that we need to remember. I've been telling you this story for a while now, and I want to pull it all together before we close. Because there's a thread running through all of these things: the inventory of the pantry, the bacon grease, the patient skillet, the beans soaking since morning, the eggs saved for the cornbread, the pot liquor that was never wasted. And that thread isn't just thrift. It isn't just survival. It's a whole philosophy about what food is and what it's for. Those women didn't cook to impress anyone. They cooked to sustain the people they loved. They didn't measure success by how elaborate the meal was. They measured it by whether everyone at the table was fed, and whether everyone at the table was together, and whether the pot was clean at the end of the night. Those were the 3 metrics. Fed, together, clean pot. And here's what I notice when I look at the way most people cook today, when they cook at all, is that the metrics have shifted to things that have very little to do with those three. Is it photogenic? Is it impressive? Is it from a recipe with 12 exotic ingredients that requires a trip to 3 different stores? And I don't say that with any judgment because I understand how life has changed. I understand that most families today have both parents working, that time is shorter, that cooking has gotten more complicated to talk about, even as it's gotten easier in terms of available ingredients. But I think something has been lost. I think the wisdom of the poor kitchen, the inventory, the patience, the reverence for nothing going to waste, the understanding that the meal is the gathering and not just the food, I think that wisdom has genuine value right now, maybe more now than it's had in a while. I want to tell you one more story before we close, and this is the one I've been holding back. This is the payoff. When I was about 15 years old, there was a winter where things got genuinely hard for us. My father had been hurt at work and couldn't work for months, and my mother was doing what she could, but there were weeks where the pantry was as bare as I can ever remember seeing it. And there was one particular evening, a Tuesday, I think, in February, cold outside in a way that made the windows weep when my mother stood at that pantry door for a long time. I watched her from the kitchen doorway. I didn't say anything. She didn't know I was there. She stood there looking at what she had, and what she had was 2 potatoes, 1 onion, half a tin of bacon grease, a cup of dried navy beans she'd been soaking since that morning, a quarter bag of cornmeal, and a single egg. I watched her close the pantry door and put on her apron and begin to cook. She started the beans on the back burner. She started the onion in the skillet. She split those 2 potatoes between the beans and the skillet, saving the bigger one for the skillet potato cake and putting the smaller one in the beans to absorb the flavor. She made cornbread with that egg and the cornmeal. She set the table with the same care she always did, cloth napkins because we had them, even if they were worn thin, and she called us all in for dinner. And that meal, 2 potatoes, 1 onion, beans, cornbread, was one of the best meals I ever sat down to in my life. I don't say that to be poetic. I say it because I can taste it right now. 60 years later, the beans were silky and smoky from the grease. The potato cake was golden on the bottom and yielded soft on top. The cornbread was tender because she'd used that egg where it would do the most good, and the pot liquor from the beans went into a cup beside my bowl for dunking. My father said that night what my grandfather always said. He looked at that table and he said, "Looks good, Mama." And my mother sat down and we said grace, and then we ate. And nobody talked about what was or wasn't in the pantry. We talked about what had happened that day. My sister had learned a new song in school. My brother had gotten in trouble for talking in class. My father had heard a funny joke from the man across the street. And I sat there at that table, eating a supper made from almost nothing, and I felt wealthy. I felt genuinely, completely, abundantly wealthy, because the meal wasn't in what was on the plate. I've thought about that evening many times over the decades since. I've thought about it when I've been at tables loaded with food and the conversation was thin and nervous and nobody quite relaxed. I've thought about it in restaurants where the food was beautiful and the company was distracted. I've thought about it when I've opened a full refrigerator and thought, for a shameful moment, that there was nothing to eat. My grandmother's saying comes back to me every time. The meal isn't in what's on the plate, it's in who's around it. I've carried that like a compass my whole life, and I want to give it to you today, if you'll take it, because I think it's true. I think it might be the truest thing about food and family that anyone has ever said in a plain American kitchen. Those women who stretched a single potato into dinner for a whole family weren't doing something small, they were doing something extraordinary. They were practicing a kind of domestic mastery that is, in its own quiet way, as impressive as anything I've ever seen. They were feeding people not just calories but dignity, not just sustenance but love in a form you could taste. They were saying, through the act of cooking, "I see you. I know you need to be fed. I made something from what we have, and I made it with care, and it is enough, and we are together, and that is everything. That is everything. Before I let you go today, I want to ask you to do one thing. Go find your oldest cookbook or your mother's recipe card or whatever piece of that kitchen wisdom you've been holding on to and try one of those simple meals. Try the potato and onion in the cast iron. Try the long simmered beans. Try not wasting the pot liquor, not because you have to, not because you're in hard times, though if you are, I hope this helps, but because there is something in that act of cooking simply and patiently and without waste that will reconnect you to something you might not even know you've been missing. And while you're doing it, think about who you want around your table, because that's the ingredient that makes everything else work. That has always been the ingredient that makes everything else work. If this story meant something to you today, please subscribe to Grandpa Almanac. We're here every week talking about the way things were, the things worth holding on to, and the wisdom that the old ways still have to offer. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss a single one. And share this with someone you think needs to hear it today, a grandchild, a neighbor, a friend who could use a reminder of what really matters. Now I want to hear from you. Down in the comments, tell me, what's the simplest meal you remember from your childhood that still means the most to you? What dish takes you right back to the kitchen you grew up in? I want to know. I read every single comment, every single one, and sometimes those comments are the best part of my week. Thank you for spending this time with me. I mean that sincerely. You could have been anywhere, and you chose to be here, at this table, for this story. That means something. The meal isn't in what's on the plate, it's in who's around it. God bless, and we'll see you next time.